Local Edition, Brad Pomerance here. We're joined today by Eric Bauman. He's the vice chair of the California Democratic Party. He is the chair of the Los Angeles County Democratic Party. Big election coming up. It's finally October. And so I want to talk about the state of the presidential race. I think it's fair to say that Mrs. Clinton had a pretty good bump out of the convention. Labor Day came around, the polls started to tighten. What I've noticed is there was a lot of emphasis on the state polls and how she was doing very well in the state polls. Now what it seems as if is that she's doing very well in the national polls, but the state polls are a bit all over the place.
Well, one thing that is in all of this polling that is always a bit disingenuous for the public is they go from a measure of all voters to a measure of likely voters. So now the polls that we're looking at are constructed based on what each individual pollster believes is the likely makeup of the election. The national poll is a nice gauge. It's a nice way for us to talk about these races. But the reality is the presidential election is not a national election. It is a state-by-state election, and you have to follow those polls on a state-by-state basis. One thing that is abundantly clear is that the Clinton campaign's investment in their field campaign for many, 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 many months is going to be a decisive difference.
It's interesting you mentioned that. There are states that have aggressive early voting. And again, it's hard to know whom to believe. But the early voting suggests, of course, we don't know the numbers, but who's returning their ballots, that Mrs. Clinton is arguably doing better in the states she needs to do better in with early voting.
Well, again, the fact that their field effort began 8 months ago, preparing, laying the groundwork for this, and that they have thousands of staff and tens of thousands of trained volunteers all across the country. And the Trump campaign did not find this important, and they chose to be entirely reliant upon the Republican National Committee, whose big announcement was a few weeks back that they had put out, 1,200 people across the country. Well, a force of 1,200 in this country, and even just in the swing states, is not a very big force.
I want to ask you about likely voters. It seems to me that this year it will be difficult to determine who's a likely voter. I almost look towards the Brexit model when we saw what happened in England, where polls suggested that Brexit would lose. It wound up winning. And a lot of folks in the postmortems said, well, our likely voter universe was not the most efficient and effective.
Well, we had that in the United States in 2014. We had races all across the country that were much closer or even reversed from what the polling was. And in fact, in President Obama's reelection in 2012, he was only 0.7 points ahead in the average, I think it was the Real Clear Politics average. In reality, he won by over 4 points. So, polling is always a snapshot in time, and it's always dependent upon how you model the voters. And there are a lot of different things that are going on. The people who are Trump's base voters, they're very angry, they're very frustrated, their world is changing around them, they're coming out to vote. But you know what? Hillary also has a core of voters that are equally as committed.
Are they, though?
Well, I believe they are. And here's the reality. As long as Donald Trump continues to be Donald Trump and he says the things that he says, it's going to continue to inflame certain people. And I want to point out there was a classic, there was a classic point a couple of weeks back when the rioting was going on in North Carolina, where in the afternoon Trump gives a speech where he blames the rioting on drugs, and he's going to stop the drugs from coming in and how the drugs affect certain communities, which of course was taken as a very racist tone. And then 3 hours later, they suddenly put him out for a speech with teleprompters where he said, the victims of all of this are African Americans, and we're going to have to help African Americans. And quite frankly, in discussing this at the time, I pointed out the difference. The real Donald Trump was the one without the teleprompter.
I want to talk about states like North Carolina, these swing states. North Carolina, if anything, seems to be a bit stubborn in favor of Mrs. Clinton. I mean, it does seem to be moving a little bit towards Mr. Trump, but she seems to be doing pretty well there, surprisingly enough. But Ohio and Iowa, those seem to be slipping a bit for Mrs. Clinton, and which is not a huge surprise given the demographic. But you look at Florida and Nevada, I mean, those are states that are very diverse, and yet those seem to be slipping a bit. Not as much as Ohio and Iowa, but what's going on here?
Well, first of all, remember that there's a very interesting phenomenon about national media coverage of these campaigns. You know, if in August, what you heard and you saw was all of Clinton's positives and all of Trump's negatives. In September, it suddenly flipped. We were talking about email. We were talking about the Clinton Foundation. We were talking about this. And towards the end of September, they finally started talking about all of this purportedly illegal activity of Trump's foundation, and so the media started swinging back. But they do that because they have to keep this horse race going, right? And they can't keep saying the same things for, you know, a campaign that's 16 months long.
Right.
So that has an impact on how people think. And the truth of the matter is, there was a recent comparison of the two websites, the two candidates, talking about policy. There were over 180,000 words of policy on Mrs. Clinton's website, and there were fewer than 2,500 on Trump's.
But how does that play? I mean, is this a year where policy matters? That
is a question. This is a year where emotion certainly matters. This is a year where connecting with people really matters. And decisive and dispositive of the outcome of this election for Democrats is what happens with millennial voters, what happens with voters of color. And the difference could not be more stark.
Well, let's talk about voters of color. Mrs. Clinton's lead amongst African American is astronomical. She could even beat Mr. Obama's spread. And Mr. Obama is an African American. What's going on there?
Look, the Clintons have a long history in the African American community. It was often said they used to call Bill Clinton America's first African American president, and that is compounded by the fact that you have President Obama going out to voters in communities of color and amongst young voters and saying, "My legacy includes electing Hillary Clinton."
I want to talk about Latinos. She is running ahead of Mr. Obama amongst Latinos, but Mr. Trump is still getting and garnering 20% of the Latino vote. Mr. Trump has said things in connection with the Latino community that many find absolutely horrific, but yet he's still garnering 20%. He hasn't attacked the African American community like he's attacked the Latino community.
Look, when Proposition 187 was on the California ballot, the measure that would have prevented undocumented kids from going to school and a wide variety of other things, 20% of the or more of the Latino community voted for that measure. There is a core portion of Latino voters who are very conservative.
I want to ask you about millennials. Millennials were very strong for Mr. Sanders. Traditionally, they've been strong for Democrats. Polls indicate that they're flirting with Mr. Johnson, maybe even Mrs. Stein. Are you concerned about millennials?
I'm always concerned about millennials because millennial voter turnout is A, very hard to predict, B, very hard to motivate, and is often inconsistent. But here's the thing that I want to say, taking us back to the exact place where we were in 2012 and 2008. In 2008, Barack Obama had this extraordinary turnout of millennial voters, of young voters for his race. As he was running for re-election in 2012, there was not a pundit who didn't say he could not possibly match young voter turnout. The inspiration was gone. There wasn't the excitement. He not only matched it, he beat it in 2012.
We'll talk soon. Let's see what happens. He is Eric Bauman, Vice Chair of the California Democratic Party. Brad Pomerance here, Charter Local Edition.